Thanks for those of you who are able to join today. So I want to start this off just by saying that, so this isn't a coding workshop, it's more theoretical. So I wanted to talk about, I guess, some of the things I've learned in the last few years that I can share. And I do want to have the caveat too that I'm not an expert in machine learning by any means, but I have some experience from some projects I was working on recently, and yeah, just hoping to share that with you. So I've set up some polls through this workshop, but since there's only a few of us here, then we might not need to use those so much, but we'll see how we go. So I just wanted to ask, first of all, how much experience those of you who are here have with machine learning. So whether you have no experience at all, whether maybe you've read a little bit about some models or tried applying some models that had already been developed, or maybe you've tried testing and training some models yourself. Just, oh yeah, cool. Okay, so that's about where I was when I started my postdoc in Germany. And so then I wanted to use machine learning for some projects I was working on. And so I guess my next question for you is why you're here, whether you're just curious or whether you might be planning to use these models in the future. Okay, excellent. So the goal of this workshop, so what I'd ideally like you to get out of this is that you'd by the end have a basic theoretical understanding of how some of these algorithms work, what types of problems you can apply them to, the steps that are required to train and evaluate a model, and some of the issues you might want to look out for while you're doing that. And maybe the idea would be after this to be able to review a paper or attend a talk and be able to assess for yourself whether the method used seemed reasonable and whether the researchers might have omitted some information that you'd need to really understand whether they went through the process that makes sense, I guess. So first I'll talk about some different types of applications and the types of models you'd use to address those applications. And then we'll go through a bit of a crash course on how to fit and evaluate a model and the types of issues you want to avoid from training the model to applying it. And I'll give a bit of a summary at the end and refer you to some further resources, because obviously this is a huge topic and this is a short workshop. So there's a lot of other resources out there that I've personally found really, really helpful. So about me, Crystal already gave a great introduction. So I'm a postdoc now at Deakin University. I consider myself a behavioural ecologist. So I'm not a statistician. But during my postdoc, I became interested in classifying the behaviour of birds using data loggers. So the main species I was working with in the last few years was the pectoral sandpiper up in the high Arctic. But because fieldwork got postponed due to COVID, I wanted some things to work on while I was at the Institute. And so Bart and Rowan Jakes Hamilton and we worked on a project trying to classify different mating behaviours in captive ruffs. And so we published that in Animal Behaviour earlier this year. And this is just a visual representation of what we were trying to do, except ours was a bit more focused on the courtship and territorial behaviours of these birds. And so the idea is that these data loggers record and so we were trying to train an algorithm to recognise different behaviours from the acceleration data, which can be really helpful if you want to, say, know what birds are doing in the wild when you can't observe them, or if you want really comprehensive around-the-clock data on behaviour, which would just be far too time-consuming to work on yourself from video. So that's my background and why I got interested in machine learning. And Okay, I think we dropped out for a second. Now we're back. Cool. Yeah, frustration. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, AI is very closely associated with machine learning. So machine learning that gets used in a lot of different ways. I found this definition online, which I thought was a pretty good representation of how I think a lot of people understand machine learning. So it's a branch of artificial intelligence and computer science, which focuses on the use of data and algorithms to imitate the way that humans learn, gradually improving accuracy. So that's one definition. But an even broader definition of machine learning relates to just the way data is actually being used. So in a traditional programming context, you have your data, your input, and you have a program, and they use that to produce some kind of output. But then with machine learning, what you actually have is your input and your desired output, and you want to develop a program that will allow you to get that output from new data. So that's what makes machine learning a bit different to the way we often think about programming and coding and statistics. And I thought it was useful to introduce this other term here, statistical learning. So machine learning is a concept in a field that's come out of artificial intelligence, so wanting to mimic the way that humans learn. Whereas at the same time, statisticians have been working on what they refer to as statistical learning. And these two things have now kind of merged because technology has made so much more possible. And they were really doing the same thing. And so if you're looking for resources on machine learning, it's also useful to look up resources for statistical learning. And as far as I can tell, the main difference between these two phrases is that if you say machine learning, people are more likely to think that what you're doing is exciting and new, and it's a word you should put in your grant applications rather than statistical learning. So the general process for and I should say too, machine learning doesn't always look the same. So I'll be making some generalizations in this workshop, but there's different ways that things can work. But the way we usually think of the how machine learning works is that you start off with your input data, you use that to develop some kind of model. And then what you want to do is train and optimize that model so that it has the best performance possible. And so you can do that by tweaking different parameters in the model and changing it in different ways and then testing its performance. And then what you want to do then is take your best model and apply it to your larger data set or the new data you're collecting or whatever context it is where you want to use it. And so there's a vast variety of questions and applications that you can use with machine learning. So that can range from, say, how many nests are in this image? Image processing is being used more and more with machine learning. So what bird species are in this image? How can we optimize the route of this surveillance drone? How long will an individual live? Can look for patterns. Can try and group things into meaningful smaller groups, looking at identifying the type of disease that an individual has, or you can also look at binary outcomes, like is that the sound of a whale or is it not? And the different types of questions relate to different types of models. So you have your supervised regression models. So that's where you have a quantitative dependent variable. So example of that would be how many nests are in this image. You can have supervised classification models. So that's where you have a categorical dependent variable, such as, is that whale or not? But then there's unsupervised models. And so these are a bit different because you don't have a specific Y variable. Instead, what these models are doing is they're looking for patterns or groups in the data. And then you can see whether those make sense for what you're trying to achieve. And then the fourth type of model, which I actually won't talk about quite so much in this workshop, is the reinforcement model. So that's where a model is using trial and error to try and improve its own performance. And so an example of how you might use that would be, say, if you're trying to optimize the route of a drone or some other, self-driving cars would be using these kind of models as well. And then there are some examples of these different types of models. So knowing what kind of problem you have and what your type of dependent variable you have will help you choose what kind of model would be appropriate. And some of these models that you're seeing here, you might not have really thought of as machine learning models like linear regression, but you can use them in that kind of context, in that kind of way. So I'm curious now too of which of these models those of you who are here have used before, ranging from linear regression to neural networks and support vector machines. Okay, so a couple of people have used tree-based methods as well. Yep. So I'll talk a bit about tree-based methods today. So like I said before, some of these models are, they don't have to be used in a machine learning context, and we will use them in other contexts, but it is possible to apply them for these types of problems. Okay, so I'm just going to step through this process and the different considerations we might have at each step. So our first step is having our input data that we're going to use to develop a model. And so one of our first questions is, how much of our data should we use when we're training a model? So say we have a data set and we want to develop a model. We need to both train the model and we need to test its performance. So we need to decide exactly how that data is going to be used. So I'm curious about your thoughts on how much of our data should we use to train a model, just roughly speaking. So should we use 20%, 70%, all of it when we're trying to develop? Okay, a couple of people going low. Good, we've got both ends of the spectrum. Okay, cool. So let's talk a little bit about this. So when we're training a model, we want to find the optimal fit. So if we don't have enough data for our model, then we might end up with a model that performs poorly because it's underfit. But if we, at the other end of the extreme, we don't want a model that's overfit either. So if we have an overfit model, it might fit perfectly for this particular data set, but it's going to be completely useless if we try applying it to a different data set. And so it's about striking the balance between having enough data to train the model, but not using so much data that we don't have any left in reserve to test its performance in an independent way. So the way that people often approach this is that you start off with your data set that you have available and you split it into different components. So you have your training set, which you use to train the model. And then you have a validation set, which you use to evaluate the performance of the model and keep tweaking it. So keep trying to improve the performance of the model so it performs better on that validation set. Then you take that model that does the best on your validation data, and you confirm again how it performs on an entirely separate section of your data, your test set. And so that should, in theory, give you a good sense of how well that model is going to perform on entirely new data that you either collect in the future or that you haven't used at all in this process. But of course, that relies on having a decent amount of data that you can separate it out in that way. And people don't always have that much data available. And so another really common approach, and I'm going to use this term a few times, so it's worth keeping this one in mind, is k-fold cross-validation. So in this process, what you do is you have multiple iterations of a process these get referred to as different folds as well, which is k-fold. So the number of folds is the number of iterations that you have. People often use 10-fold cross-validation. So what you do is in, say, the first iteration or first fold, you have some proportion of your data that you use to train the model, and then the rest of the data you use to test the model. And then what you do then is you repeat this process with the same data set and to test it. So you're retraining the model and testing its performance. And you repeat this process until I just got a notification saying your internet connection is unstable. So just wave at me, Crystal, if you can't hear me anymore. But so you repeat this process until every part of the data has been used as the test set. And so the idea is that this should then give you, if you take all of these folds and either do something to say average the performance of the model across all the different folds, then that should also give you a reasonably good sense of how well this model would perform on a new data set. So often what you end up doing after you've done one of these processes is that you get a good sense of, you set what the parameters of the model are. And so you've done all that tweaking to figure out the framework of the model. And then you use this entire data set to train the model, and then you can apply that model to new data. And so this process is used to estimate the performance of the model. As how it would perform in the future. And so remember too that in this k-fold cross-validation process, even though we eventually use all of our data to train the model, within each of these iterations, we're using part of it to train the model and part of it to test it. So I'm talking about in each iteration for cross-validation, how much data do you think we should use? Okay, so we have a 70% this time. Any other thoughts? Okay, so what people, it obviously depends on how much data you have, but generally people go for at least 70%. So in cross-validation and in the other method I mentioned before, where you have training, validation, test, people usually use 70 to 80% of the data for training and reserve 10 to maybe 20 to 30% for testing. If you have a really, really huge data set, people might actually increase the proportion of data that's used for training up to say 90%, because they still have plenty of data to test the performance of that model. So the idea generally here is that you want to use as much as data as possible for training, because that's going to create a better model, but you need to leave just enough in reserve that you can check how well that model is performing. So another thing to keep in mind too is that for some models you can just throw the raw data at it and they can work with it. But for a lot of models, you need to select features that the model will use. So in the case of my data, when I'm working with the captive roughs, is we have some raw accelerometry data, but the model's going to do better if you take particular information from that data to feed into it. So that might be, say, the overall acceleration across all three axes might be one feature. Another feature might be average change in acceleration on the z-axis, or the standard deviation in the y-axis. So you end up with a lot of different values that are being given to the model that's going to use to try and recognize whatever it is you're trying to get it to recognize. And so you can already tell from my example is that you could end up with an infinite number of features that you can feed into these models, and you need to choose somehow which features to use, because if you give the model too much, then it's going to take a very, very long time to run, and it might be more complicated than it needs to be. So here's another example. Let's say we have, let's say we want to develop a model to predict heart disease. So we want to be able to bring in a patient and have a good prediction of whether that person is at high risk of developing heart disease. But we want to make this model reasonably simple. We don't want to have every single, have to look at every single thing under the sun to try and figure this out. And so we have a data set where we have lots of people who did develop heart disease and lots of people who didn't, and we have all sorts of information about them. And then we want to develop this model. So one approach could be that we have 1,000 possible risk factors, and then across our entire data set, we look at simple correlations between this feature and the incidence of heart disease. And then we use only the 100 features that are most highly correlated for our model. Now, does this sound like a good approach? I'll let you think about it for a moment. So one problem with this approach is this part here, using the entire data set. And the reason this is a problem is that, remember, this is the data set we're using both to train our model and to test its performance. So if we use our entire data set, let's say by chance, there are people who developed heart disease, but a lot of people in this data set who developed heart disease who just happened to play basketball. And then, but sporting activity comes out as a strong predictor of the risk of heart disease. You then develop this model, you then test the model on a subset of your data, but that data was also used to choose your features. And then this model set, and then it looks like the performance of this model is really great. But then you apply that model to a new data set, and maybe sporting activity isn't a great predictor of heart disease at all. And then that model, you're going to think that model's doing much better than it actually is. So it's really important to, anything that you're doing, any decisions you're making about how to develop your model are made within this cross-validation process where you're keeping your training data separate from your testing data. So in this study that was published in 2021, they compared other research that had used one of two approaches for their feature selection. So in one scheme, people did their feature selection first before, dividing up the data and into folds for cross-validation and developing a model. Or in the other process, feature selection was done within each fold of the cross-validation. Or another way to approach this would be that you do this within your training data without looking at all at your testing data. And they found that there was a bias where if feature selection was done before cross-validation, estimates of accuracy were about 17% higher, which is pretty huge. So this is, I think, a very easy thing to overlook and very important to keep in mind. So any decisions you're making about how to develop your model and how your model should look needs to be made with some data kept in reserve, independent, that you can actually use to independently test how well the model performs. And so this is an example of what's referred to as data leakage. So data leakage occurs when a training data set contains information or clues that won't be available at the time of prediction. So another good example of this comes from, I just find this example really funny. This was for a Kaggle competition. And so I don't know if you're familiar with Kaggle, but it's a great platform for data scientists to throw their skills at different problems. So in this case, the problem was that these researchers had a lot of audio recordings, and these audio recordings either included audio of whales or no audio of whales. And they wanted to know whether, be able to detect whether there were whales in the recordings or not. And what one team found, this team referred to themselves as Leaky Larry, was that they could get a really excellent model that performed better than any other models that anyone else was creating without using any of the information that was actually in the audio files. So this was based on 3 types of data leakage. So one was that audio clips of whales tended to be longer. The audio clips of non-whales almost always had timestamps that were multiples of 10 milliseconds. And the audio clips of whales tended to be grouped together in time. Now, with this example, it might seem like, well, no one's actually going to make that mistake. No one's going to develop a model that doesn't use any of the audio material. But you can imagine how people might accidentally use this information without realizing. Say, if you have features in there that relate to the length of particular frequencies or something like that, then these might actually be taking information that isn't relevant. So this was, I think, a good example of being really careful about the way you're training your model and the way that you're testing it and the data set that you're using. So how do you avoid overfitting and leakage? Because this is an issue really of overfitting, of developing a model that performs great on the data set you have, but is going to be not so great anywhere else. So it's really important to split the data up for doing any data exploration or preparation or feature selection. Or if you're using cross-validation, then you do this separately within each fold. It's also useful to look at the features that are being selected by the model, because there are some processes that will select the features automatically. And so you might want to look at these features to see if there's anything that you find weird or unexpected. It's also really important to check for duplications in the data. So especially duplications that could be in both the training and the validation sets. Because again, that means that you're testing the data on testing the model on data that's more similar to the training data than it would be in real life. So you want these data sets to be as different from each other as they will be when you're actually applying the model. Also, don't keep using the same test set and trying to improve in performance, because that means that you might just develop a model that's great for that particular data set, but again, not so useful for other data sets. And I think general piece of advice is to be suspicious of models that perform really well. So when Rowan and I were working on this classification model for behavior, we found that if we kept tweaking a particular feature, the model just seemed to keep infinitely getting better and better, which seemed really great at first, and then we got really suspicious. And we found that what was actually happening was something like this. So yeah, so it's sometimes things can be too good to be true. All right, so now that we have our data, we know how we want to divide it up, we've figured out which features we want to use, we need to think about how we're going to develop and train that model. And we also need to decide what type of model we want to use. So before I mentioned these different types of models, so the supervised regression, supervised classification, unsupervised reinforcement models. And different types of models will have, different, depending on your question, then it'll affect which type of model you want to choose. So I'm curious which types of models you think are most relevant for your work. I think this question will ask you to rank what is most relevant for you. Okay, so for someone, supervised classification is most relevant. Cool. Yeah, we'll spend a bit of time talking about that one. That's what I've also have the most experience with. Unsupervised is interesting because it can be sometimes more relevant than you think. So some questions that relate to supervised classification can also potentially be solved by unsupervised, which we might touch on a little bit later. So I'll just move on. So here are some examples of different models that can be used for each of these, I guess, categories. So today I'll just talk briefly through how some of the more common ones work, skipping over linear and logistic regression, because I think most of us, and PCAs, because I think most of us have some experience with those and how those work. But I'll talk through some of these other methods, starting with the models that can be used for supervised context, particularly classification. So just to go back a bit with supervised models, the way these tend to work is that the problem you have is you have some data and you want to get, want to be able to label that data and make predictions for it in the future. And so you start off with a data set where you have features and you have labels associated with those features. So in my case, I would have features associated with the accelerometry data, and my label will be the behavior that the bird is actually doing. And I will have gotten that by watching the birds while they're wearing the accelerometer. And then we want to build a model that relates those labels to those features. And then in the future, what we want to be able to do is take new data, extract the features from that data, and then use our model to predict the label. So in this case, the behavior. And so one approach to that kind of problem is by using decision trees. So a couple of you mentioned you have experience with these already. So these decision trees really work like dichotomous keys. So it's a sequence of binary decisions, and each split in the tree is trying to separate the classes as much as possible. And you need to specify with these decision trees when you want them to stop. So when should they stop splitting the data? So that might be, say, when you have less than 3 observations at each end of the tree, at each node. And there are also steps for pruning back the tree to reduce complexity and to reduce overfitting. So the advantage of this approach is that these models are really easy to interpret. You have a good sense of exactly what they're doing, and they handle qualitative predictors really well. So that might be something like, I don't know, color or yes or no type questions. The problem or the downside of a decision tree is that it's not so robust. So if you have small changes in the data set that change how the data is split at an early stage in the tree, then that's going to have a big effect on how the model looks, and it's going to have potentially a big effect on how the model performs. And partly as a result of this, decision trees don't tend to perform as well as a lot of other methods that are available. But there are some things you can do with trees that make them perform better. So one really common approach is bagging. So with bagging, the way that works is that you build lots of trees from random subsets of the data, and then you take the average across all those different trees, so like the majority decision. And so that tends to already improve the performance of the decision tree. And random forest is a special case of bagging where at each split of the tree, you only use a random subset of the predictors or features. So this might sound a little bit counterintuitive because you're giving the model less data to work with. But what this actually does is it forces, you're growing lots of different trees, and it forces each tree to grow a little differently. So if it only has a bit of data, some of the predictors available, then it has to use those rather than picking the same predictors or features at the same points of the tree every time. And so this forces the trees to be more different from each other and to form in different ways. And then what that does is it reduces the variance of predictions, and it makes the outcome more robust. So, if you were to change the data set a bit or take out a particular observation, that kind of thing, it's still going to produce something a little more similar. And the nice thing about this approach, which I really like, is that no matter how many trees you add, you're not at risk of overfitting because of this approach where you're taking random subsets of data and you're using random subsets of features to build those trees. So there's not really a risk of overfitting with these models. It's just that the more trees you add, the longer it takes for the model to run. So random forest is seems to be one of the more popular approaches in behavioral ecology, I would say. And there are a lot of really nice resources and packages available in R to be able to use these. So these are kind of my favorite approach, I think, as a starting point for a lot of these models, depending on, of course, your question. Another popular approach too, which is similar to random forest, is boosting. So this also involves growing trees, but then rather than growing all the trees at the same time, you're growing them in sequence. And so each tree in the sequence is set up to reduce the deficiencies of the previous tree. And because of that, when boosting is done well, it tends to perform better than random forest. But there is a risk of overfitting with this method if you use too many trees or add too many trees, because of this way of the way each thing is improving on the previous thing. So there's also a lot of resources for boosting in R and that kind of thing as well. And so I think if you make sure you understand the way that your model works with boosting, and you're using packages too that can help guide you through the process, then this is also a really nice approach. A completely different approach or type of model is the support vector machine. So what this model is trying to do is find a line to separate data points. If you're in a two-dimensional space, it'll be a line. If you're in a three-dimensional space with at least 3 factors or predictors, then it'll be a plane, or you might have many, many predictors, in which case it's a hyperplane, which is very difficult to visualize. But essentially what it's doing is trying to draw a line to separate data points. And so in these pictures here, these visualizations, you can see that there's a lot of ways of drawing a perfect line that will completely separate these two groups. But of course, that isn't always the case. And so some of the things you need to specify with support vector machine are what the definition of a separation is, because you can relax that definition and more or less to allow those lines to cross over more into different groups. And there's also things you can do to change the way this feature space is represented, or enrich or enlarge it, which will also affect the way that the model can separate the groups. And another type of model, which I get the impression is getting more and more popular in behavioral ecology as well, is the Markov or hidden Markov model. And so the advantage of this type of model is that it accounts for sequences in data. So this is obviously really useful for any data that, say, involves a time series. And what it does is, or what the probabilities that it needs to estimate are the probability of starting in a particular state and the probability of transitioning from any given state to any other given state. So a simple example of this would be, say, that you want to be able to predict where a person is, whether they're at home, whether they're at the office, or whether they're on holiday in Paris. And then, so you'd have their probability of starting in each particular state. So maybe they're most likely to start at home. And then you have their probability of staying at home, or transitioning to work, or transitioning to Paris. And then that means that for any point in the sequence, whether that's at the point 1 or point 10 or point 20, you can estimate the probability of where they're going to be. And then a special case of the Markov model is the hidden Markov model. So that's where you're using a proxy for the state that you want to measure. So this also requires us to know the probability of a state given whatever it is that you're observing. So let's say for the previous example, what we have is data on where someone is, but what we're actually interested in is what they're doing. So what we're observing is this information, whether they're at home or at the office or in Paris, and then we know for each of those places what the probability of different behaviors is. So let's say at the office, there's a 70% chance that someone's working and a 5% chance that they're taking a nap. And so with this type of model, we'd have data on the probability of starting at a particular state. So in this case, the state would be the behavior. We'd have their probability of transitioning between different behaviors, and we'd also have their probability of being in a performing particular behavior, depending on where they are. So this is also a kind of model that can be used, say, in my context with the acceleration data. So we have data on accelerometry and different features related to accelerometry, but what we're actually interested in is the behavior. And another model that can be used for supervised models is the artificial neural network, that also gets referred to as deep learning. So when people think about machine learning, often they think of this type of model. So this is, I guess, loosely structured to be modeling what's going on in the brain in a simplistic kind of way. So the model is structured in layers of nodes, and the nodes in each layer take information from the previous layer, process it, and pass it on to the next layer. So the simplest possible artificial neural network you can have has just one node in each layer, so an input, the model, and the output, which is actually just the same as a logistic regression. But of course, this can get much more complicated, where you have many input nodes and then hidden layers in between, and then an output layer. And the connections between the nodes have weights, which determine their importance for the output. And the output, the performance of the model overall, is rated by some kind of function. So the way this can work is that the data is fed through this complex layer of nodes, produces an output. That output is rated in some way, and then the model repeats the process but adjusts the weight of some of these connections, and then you can see if the model performs better or worse. And then based on this information, it can continue adjusting these weights to try and optimize the performance of the model, and until you end up with a final model with the final weights for each of these connections. And I just want to mention here too that the convolutional neural networks, because this is what's often used in image processing. And so this is a special type of artificial neural network that has particular types of hidden layers between the input and the output. So there are convolution layers, and what these are doing is they're looking for specific patterns. So each node in this layer is tasked with identifying a particular pattern. So let's say in this image here, these nodes are each detecting different specific patterns in that image. And then in the pooling layer, this information is downsampled and summarized into something else. So here you can see that these parts of the pattern together are recognized to together become an eye. So if this is here, and this is here, and they're together, then this is an eye, or this particular pattern. And by repeating that process back and forth, so often this goes through multiple iterations of convolution, pooling, until the model is able to come up with some label for this image. And so in this case, by getting all these different pieces of information together, recognizing these different patterns in combination, this model has recognized that this is an image of a tiger. And artificial neural networks can be used in a lot of different processes. So yeah, deep learning can be used for both supervised problems, unsupervised problems, and also for reinforcement learning. So they're pretty versatile. So most of what I've talked about so far has been for supervised learning. So this is where you know what you want your output to look like. Unsupervised learning is a bit different because it's looking for patterns or clusters. And so sometimes this can be actually used to solve the same problem. So for example, in this case, you have different images of animals and it's labeling them with duck or not duck, and that's producing this output. So then you have image, model, and that says, okay, this is a duck. With unsupervised learning, what you can do is give this information to the model without any particular expectation and ask it to form clusters. And in this case, this model is also still coming up with these are ducks, and here are two other things that are not ducks. So actually, in this case, you could also use an unsupervised algorithm to solve this same problem of being able to distinguish ducks from not ducks if that is a natural cluster in the data that the algorithm can find. So a really common model for unsupervised learning is k-means clustering. This is often used in gene expression work. It's not something I personally have experience with, but I'm sure many other people in this group would. So the way this model is working is that you have some representation of your data points in space, and each of these points is just randomly assigned a number from 1 up to the number of clusters you want to try and look for. So let's say you're trying to look for 3 clusters, every point will be assigned a number randomly from 1 to 3. Then what the model does is it finds the centroid of each of these clusters that it's labeled. So you can see in this image here, so here we have random assignment, and then it finds these centroids for each of these clusters, which by chance just happen to be a little bit away from each other. And then it reassigns each observation to whichever cluster has the closest centroid. So now we have all the points over here are cluster 1, all the points here, cluster 2, and here, cluster 3. And then we'll do the same thing again. So it'll reassign the centroid to each of these clusters, and then it will keep doing this until the assignments are no longer changing. So these clusters have become stable and are separated from each other, which is quite a simple and logical approach. So some things to consider with k-means clustering is that the result will vary depending on just this original random assignment. So whatever happens here is going to affect how things turn out. So you can see here how the random assignment, the different at the start, can produce different clusters. And choosing the number of clusters can be tricky unless you have a really clear expectation of there should be X many groups. So, in this particular case, you can see the data represented in 2 clusters, 3 clusters, or 4 clusters, and you have to make some decision about which number of clusters makes the most sense. There are also questions with k-means clustering about how to measure distance between different observations if you have lots of different variables. And it also means that the way you scale your variables is going to have a big effect on how these groups are defined, because of course, if some variables have larger differences in values than others, then they're going to contribute more to the way these clusters are defined. And so this was just an example of how k-means clustering might be used in the context of gene expression. Okay, so I mentioned before that deep learning or artificial neural networks can be really versatile. You can use it for any of the problems that I've mentioned before. So why don't we just always use deep learning? I'll give people a chance to say something here. So yeah. So questions of time and experience and simplicity. And these are all really good points. So I wanted to mention this example. So there was a study published in Nature in 2018 that found that deep learning could be used to predict aftershock patterns after earthquakes, which seems, really cool. The following year, some other researchers published another paper showing that actually deep learning wasn't even necessary to solve this problem. And actually, one artificial neural network was better at predicting aftershock patterns than the very complex model that the original authors had used. So in other words, a logistic regression solved this problem better than an artificial neural network. So I think this just highlights that people can be, and I think it's very easy to make this mistake, is just assuming that a more complex model, more complicated model is going to do better. But this just isn't always true. So, like some of you mentioned, it's worth trying to keep things simple, and complexity isn't everything, because these simple models are much quicker to run and they can be easier to interpret, which in some contexts is more important than having a really complex and accurate model anyway. Okay, so speaking of accuracy, we need some way of assessing how well a model is performing. And so this is going to be a really important step in our process, is deciding which metrics we want to use to evaluate the performance of the model. And a very simple and intuitive metric to use is just accuracy. So if you have your total number of predictions, what proportion of those were correct? So here's an example. Let's say we have a model for predicting cancer from gene expression, and that predicts 999 cases correctly out of 1,000. So it has an accuracy of 0.999. Is this a good model? So there's some subjectiveness here. Is this a good model? So then now let's add the piece of information that 1 in 1,000 people in the population actually have cancer. So that means that a model that predicts that nobody has cancer will have an accuracy of 0.999. So it's really important to consider how the rarity of particular outcomes can affect your estimates of something like accuracy. So in this case, a model might have an accuracy of 0.999, but it's going to be completely useless at predicting cancer because it's going to predict that nobody, in this case, predict that nobody has cancer. So some other metrics that can be useful when you have unbalanced classes like this are precision and recall. So precision, the lower the precision, the more false positives you have. Whereas with recall, the lower the recall, the more false negatives you have. And so these can be used to assess the performance of the model at estimating different classes. And it's also really common for people to combine these two metrics into a single metric called the F measure or the F1. So that is calculated just as 2 times the precision times the recall divided by the precision plus the recall. And there are other metrics that are possible to use, but the most important thing is to choose an appropriate metric for the problem and for what you're actually trying to achieve. Okay, and so now we have, let's say now we have a model that we're really happy with. It performs well, we've been careful all the way along this process, and now we want to apply this model to new data. And then the problem you need to consider is how well is this model going to generalize to different types of contexts. So this is an example from a study of, I think it was pygmy goats and ibex. And so in this study, they were trying to estimate classified behaviors from accelerometry data, similar to what I was trying to do with the birds. And first they estimated the performance of their model for the pygmy goats and for the ibex. And in this case, what they did is they randomly split their data set between for training and for testing, and then assessed its performance the way we talked about before. And this model looks absolutely fantastic, right? It's got a really high accuracy and a really high F1 statistic. So that's based on precision and recall, everything's above 95%, looks brilliant. Then what they did is they tried splitting the data so that they were only testing the model on new individuals. So they were training the model on some individuals and testing it on others. And this is what happened to the performance of the model. So what you can see here is that this model was really great at predicting behaviors for the same individuals. But if they were to apply this model to new individuals, say out in the wild or even different individuals in the same enclosure, the performance of the model would be much, much worse. And so it's really important then to think about how you're planning to apply the model and test the model in an appropriate way that represents that context. Okay, so what are some things to be aware of to summarize everything we've talked about so far? I'm not sure if I allowed you to put in an answer, but unknown unknowns. Yep. Yeah, so always important to keep in mind the question that you're trying to solve and whether the methods are appropriate to the question. I think something that is very easy to do, particularly when you're first trying to use these models, is you lift an approach from another study and apply it exactly the same way they have, which might be great, but you do need to consider whether it fits the problem that you're trying to solve and whether there's anything else that you need to consider. So that might include whether you want to, ultimately apply that model to new individuals, or whether you want to apply that model to a different species or in different environments. And all of these things can affect how the model's going to perform. And above all else, I think what you want to avoid is having a model that you think is performing really well when actually it isn't. And then that can end up giving you very biased results that would be very easy to, I guess, get carried away with and not know that there are problems in your data set. And yeah, there's no need to make things more complicated than they need to be for the sake of time and resources and the interpretability of the model. Then there's no need to go for something really complicated if something simple will do the job. Okay, so I'll just summarize by saying machine learning is a really powerful tool that can be applied to a lot of different problems. And when applying these models, some things to be aware of are overfitting and data leakage, because that can lead you to overestimate the performance of the model. Like we just mentioned, more complex models aren't necessarily better, and they can be much more difficult to interpret as well. And it's important to choose relevant and appropriate metrics to measure the model performance. Then you also need to check the model performs well in the context where it will be applied. So actually the ideal scenario too in a lot of cases is to develop and test your model and then apply it, but then also collect new data as you're applying it to check that it is performing the way you expect it to. And of course, it's going to be unwelcome news if it's not, but it's better to know that than to be using a model that you think is doing something different to what it is. So I've ended up going a bit quicker than I expected. But we can chat a bit after this as well. The main resources, there's a lot of resources out there. One that I highly recommend is this book, An Introduction to Statistical Learning. It's available for free online, the entire book. You can download it as a PDF. And it's developed by this group who also offer from Stanford. And they also offer a free online course that goes alongside this book, which is where I learned most of what I know about machine learning so far. It's a fantastic course, and yeah, again, it's free. You can do it at your own pace online, and they talk and go into a lot more depth with a lot of these models and the problems and the mathematics underlying these models as well. So yeah, really highly recommend that. And there are also a lot of R packages out there. I mean, too many that are to be worth mentioning them all, but just two that I have some experience with are Carrot and the Random Forest package. Both of those are pretty neat. And yes, that is all I have here. But yeah, happy to chat some more about different maybe problems that people are encountering, or just discuss this more broadly.